Hello everyone, and welcome from the Contemplative Sciences Center. Thank you for coming. I'm going to be brief because I want to have as much time as possible with this gentleman to speak. So I'd like to introduce to you Dr. Bessel Kolk. I tried to say it correctly. He is our guest here today from Boston. Dr. Kolk has been the medical director of the Trauma Center in Boston for the past 30 years. He's a professor of psychiatry at Boston University Medical School and serves as the director of the National Center for Child Traumatic Stress Complex Trauma Network. I can go on and on. There's a lot to say about him, but I'm not going to because I really do want to let this wonderful, wonderful man impart his wisdom. So if you could please join me in welcoming Dr. Kolk.
Okay, good. Just stick it there. All right. First of all, I'm very honored to be here at the Center for Contemplative Sciences. I wish you guys were in Boston so I could come and visit you all the time. I've been so impressed with everybody I've talked to, and I wish that instead of my talking, all the people who are part of your group are talking because you could teach me so much. The other thing is that my computer kept crashing today. And so I've tried to put the presentation together, and it may not be quite as smooth as I'd like it to be, but hey, we'll do the best we can. So let's talk so I do trauma, and have done so for a long time. And the way I got into trauma is interesting to me at least. I needed to pay for my own psychoanalysis, and the only not that it helped particularly, but still had to go through it. And in order to pay for it, I had to work for the VA because the VA paid for your psychoanalysis. And that's the only reason why I went there. And the very first patient I saw there was a Vietnam veteran who clearly had been a very competent, amazing guy before going to Vietnam, and who came back and he was a wreck. He was an alcoholic, he was violent, and he had nightmares. I knew something about nightmares, and I was still a person who believed in a better life through chemistry at the time, and so I knew how to treat nightmares with chemicals, and I said, take these chemicals and your nightmares will go away, and this will be gone. And 2 weeks later he came back, and I said, so how were my wonderful drugs? And he said, I decided that I cannot take these medicines because if I stop having my nightmares, my life will become meaningless because I need to be a living memorial for my friends who died in Vietnam. And that statement totally blew me away, and that statement made me decide to study this very complex issue of how a person can be totally transformed by a life experience and then become totally stuck on the past and unable to live in the present. And so that's where it started. And then I did a lot of work in trauma around the world, and then 9/11 came. And 9/11 helped me to sort of put a lot of things in focus because at home we could talk about a common experience. And when that happened, I was very curious about my own reaction and the reaction of people around me. And my own reaction was that the moment I heard the news, I first tried to tell a joke because that's what I always do. And when the magnitude of the disaster became clear to me, I called my wife, I called my kids, and I tried to call my friends in New York, and was struck that my first reaction was to call my tribe. And so I thought that must be the common human reaction, is when something terrible happens, you go to your tribe. And so that immediately brings home that we are deeply connected human beings, interconnected human beings, and we barely exist apart from our social environment, and that trauma takes place in a social context, something that is barely talked about in the mainstream treatment of PTSD. And by and large, what we saw in New York was amazing also, because as long as your social life is intact and people are there for you, people are astoundingly resilient and are amazingly capable of putting up with a lot of horrible pain. And it became very clear that trauma is largely something that terrible that happens to you, and nobody is there to be with you at that time. And so almost immediately the issue of attachment and our brain being geared to be attached to other people became a very major part of my work and that of my colleagues. And the next thing that I noticed is that I spaced out. I was just sitting there like a bump on the log, inactive, unable to move. And then later on, when I saw this movie about how our president reacted to the news of 9/11, he had this 17-minute gap of consciousness where he held a book upside down, reading My Pet Goat, after having been told that America was under attack. I realized that there was a little bit of George Bush in me also, and luckily for the world, or maybe unluckily at the end, I was not the head of the free world, which had very terrible disasters. So spacing out in response to trauma is also something to be expected, except when you're in charge, you shouldn't do that. What also struck me at that point is how comforting Rudy Giuliani was that day. And Rudy, I knew about Rudy because I spent a lot of time in New York. He was not one of my favorite people, but that day he was great because he was telling us what he thought was going on. And it turned out, in retrospect, most of what he said was wrong. But it didn't matter, because when you're lost, it's very important for somebody to say to you, I know what's going on. Don't worry about it, little boy. I have the situation at hand. And as therapists, to some degree, we are put in that position with our patients that we need to be the embodiment of self-confidence and say, I know how to fix you. That becomes very important without being arrogant at the same time. Very difficult combination. So that's the situation from the distance. And then there is what happened. Wait a second. Okay, wrong slides, okay. The next thing that I noticed, and that we all noticed, was what people did who lives was in actual danger. And usually when I ask therapists who are sort of mentally oriented people, what do you see here? They say, I see panicked people, I see scared people, I see something or another, and they give it psychological terms. In fact, what we see here is people who are running. And that's very important, because the response to a terrible event is you start moving your body. And if you can move your body and get out of harm's way, you'll be okay. And so at the very foundation of trauma is immobility, physical immobility. And we now understand the circuits of what happens with immobility. I may have time to go into it, namely that the chemicals that are secreted in your brain to help you to move and to fight, if you're held down and immobilized, they go to a different pathway, which I may show you, and they get turned against you and flood you with sensations of helplessness, rage, powerlessness, and collapse. And that becomes your habitual way of being in the world. So chemicals that were meant to help you to fight back and to run are turned upon yourself. And that has very important implications to my mind for treatment, namely that traumatized people are unable to move, unable to take action, and maybe one of the most important ways in which we can help traumatized people is to actually take action and to do things. This morning we talked about, I was sort of involved in the Truth Commission in South Africa, and I had a chance to meet Nelson Mandela, and I asked him, I forgot exactly what the words were that I used, but something like, you were the head of the terrorist army. I was on your side, but you tried to kill all those people who looked just like me. And then you were put in jail, and you came out as a saint. And so, what do you account for this transformation? And he said, boxing. And then, now knowing, understanding something about the neurobiology of trauma, it made perfect sense. Because in boxing, you need to be very conscious about what the other person is about to do. You need to be very conscious about your own body. You need to, in microseconds, assess what the other person is doing, and in microseconds, plan your actions and do a whole variety of internal maps of what you should do. And those are exactly the things that go wrong when you get traumatized, because all the areas of your brain having to do with prospection, imagining what will happen next, feeling yourself, knowing yourself, get very deeply affected by having been traumatized. And so the treatment of trauma starts to get located in people really becoming deeply aware of what's actually going on inside of them and learning how to take the action that makes their bodies feel safe. And so that's very different from the sort of symbolic treatment that we have been focusing on in Western psychology for the last 100 years. Okay. So while this was going on, I had a flashback to my anatomy textbook in medical school, which is probably not a very common thing to have. This is the last page of Netto's textbook of anatomy, and I'm looking at all those people in New York, and I thought, there it is. Netto drew the picture of what happens when people are traumatized, and what happens, and our research and other people's research shows that when you get in a state of high arousal and fear, your frontal lobe shuts down, you take leave of your senses, your limbic system takes over, your animal survival brain takes over, secreting all kinds of hormones and chemicals and electrical circuits to get you to save yourself. And you become like an animal. A very important issue that is, I think, oftentimes ignored among psychologists who have tremendous faith in our rational selves. And I would like you to think about, actually, I met a person the other day who said, I've never done that, which is fascinating. But have you ever said horrible, nasty, mean, and irresponsible things to people you love? And afterwards you say, oh honey, I'm so sorry, I didn't mean that, or you say something. And your honey, being invested in sticking with you, says, oh, I know, you had an upsetting day in the office, or somebody's an asshole to you, or something like that. But what you really should say to your honey when they do that, or your honey should say to you, is that, I know your frontal lobe didn't mean that. But your limbic system means everything that you just said. And if we want to have an all right relationship, you better get to do some limbic system therapy to take care of that animal survival part of your brain. And what's amazing to me is that, and maybe in the Center for Contemplative Sciences, you guys are going to develop some limbic system therapy, because mainstream psychology has sucked at that. Because mainstream psychology still thinks that if you just can think hard enough, you can figure it out, you can somehow find a pathway to that primitive animal brain to make yourself behave better. And you know, there is no such pathway. There are some pathways, which has very much to do with the Center for Contemplative Science, which we'll get into. So basically, we all get into this situation. We all have been in states of extreme threat where we fight, run, do something, and that our body is hyper aroused. And then when we come to safety, this comes to an end. And we calm ourselves, we get calm and say, oh my God, I survived this horrible accident, or I was almost raped, or I was almost assaulted or something, and you come home, and then you are not traumatized because you feel safe again, and this circuit comes to an end. To my mind, what being traumatized is about is that this circuit doesn't come to rest. And this circuit keeps running over and over again and gets easily triggered. Nothing to do with reason, everything to do with your very primitive survival brain. And so our challenge is, how do we get back there? And what's interesting to me is that in mainstream Western sort of interventions, there has been very little attention to that. And then when you go to Asia or Africa, and you look what people have done there, you say, people have developed all kinds of things in other countries where they can actually access those systems. And the first time I became aware of that, I was in China in 1991 or something. Miserable. They hated us, they probably still hate us, but don't show it as much. Treated us badly, and I'm terribly homesick. Sit in my hotel room, and I look down in the park below me, and I see 10,000 Chinese going, what the hell are those people doing? But I'm homesick and lonely, and I go into the park, and I go, there's all those other people. And after doing that, I feel so much better. I think, nobody really enjoys living in Beijing. It's a very tough place, certainly at that time. But they have learned how to do something with their bodies that makes it tolerable to live in a terrible place. And you go to India, and those of you who have been to India, that is not an easy place to live either. You don't really sort of voluntarily say, hey, let's just raise our kids in Mumbai or something. But again, people have developed certain techniques that help them to tolerate and become quiet. Things like yoga, qigong, etc., etc. And so they're much better at that than we are. And I think you guys are all studying and paying attention to those issues. So what happened after New York was fascinating. And that is that those of us who were right there after what happened, New York was a transformed city. Any New Yorkers here in this room? New York was transformed after 9/11. It's amazing. Nobody taught you four-letter words, I might use them here. Usual thing, they were very gentle, very kind. For about 6 months, New York was a transformed city. And that is sort of the nature of a community that survives. I think it's part of our evolutionary heritage, that when you're in a state of very high fear and hyperarousal, you band together and you're nice to each other. And you help to calm that central nervous system down. And even in New York, people would say, take your time crossing the street. Would you like another coffee? Would you like to stay a little bit longer? And it was a weird experience to go to New York at that time. But it was a natural response of calming yourself down in a very hyperactive, frightened central nervous system. And when people study the effect of 9/11 in New York, it turns out that there was an extremely low rate of PTSD. And that clearly was the effect of the incredible outpouring of love, concern, support, all that good stuff that civilization brings. And I think if you hate civilization, that was the right place to hit it, because it really was. And one of the great things about what happened in New York, September 12th, none of us knew what had happened. We were just living with this terror. Our president had disappeared, nobody's talking. And the New York Times puts out in the September 12th edition, puts out a whole special section from artists and writers who write about how you cope with not knowing what's going on. So almost immediately, height of civilization, people try to make meaning out of something that's basically meaningless and try to form a sense of community. Spectacular, almost no PTSD. This is the opposite. This is a picture after Hurricane Katrina, which produced the highest rate of PTSD ever in a civilian population. And what happens here? You see 10 people lying on stretchers. These guys are filled with stress hormones. They have just lost their homes, they've lost their families. And why do they have stress hormones? In order to go to the Home Depot, buy some nails, buy some 2x4s, and fix their roofs and fix their houses. That's what we have stress hormones for. They're very good. But if you tie people down and immobilize them, you traumatize them. As the rate of PTSD after Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans is 35%. Directly due to the social intervention or the lack of social intervention of rendering people helpless. So the issue of how much we work on making people helpless and not helpless becomes very central. So here's my poster boy. This Noam Sol, at the time was 5 years old, and Noam is the son of Jack Sol and Esther Perel, who some of you may have heard about, and he went to PS 234. It's a little primary school that looks out on the World Trade Center. And on the morning of September 11th, he goes to school at 8:45. 7 minutes later, the planes hit. Pandemonium breaks out. All the kids go downstairs. The parents have run back to the school to pick up their kids, and at that point, they all start running for their lives. So pandemonium breaks out. On the morning of September 12th at 9 o'clock, Noam draws this particular picture. And a week later, I'm visiting my friends, and I say to Noam, "That's really what happened to you. Can I have that picture?" He says, "I'll sell it to you." So I bought it for $100, and it's in that book now. And I bought it with the idea of that it would be in that book. And so he asked him, "So what happened to you?" And so he said, "Okay, I saw the plane hit the World Trade Center. There was a lot of smoke and fire. I saw people jumping out of the building. And I saw firefighters." And I said, "Oh, yeah. Wow. So what's this over here?" He says, "You know, when the plane hit, there was this fireball, and that created a lot of heat. And the heat came through our classroom window, and I still feel the heat of the airplanes." And I think that's how people remember trauma. It's not a story, it is sensation. Huh? And so everybody, for example, who I met with, who was in the World Trade Center that particular day, talks about the horrendous de-hissing of that gigantic building and the sounds, and the horrifying sounds that they cannot get out of their heads. And this has something to do with the lack of integration and breakdown of the thalamus in the brain, that in states of very high arousal cannot transform a sensation into a story, but the sensations and the sounds stay alive. So it's the nature of traumatic stress. You see the images, you feel the sensations, you hear the sounds, you smell the smells, stuff like that. So it's a very sensory experience, which becomes important later on. And then I asked him, "So what's this?" He says, "There's a trampoline." And I said, "What's a trampoline doing there?" He says, "Oh, so the next time this happens, people will be okay when they jump out of the building." And I'm blown away, because I've just heard our president coming to comfort the Western world about what happened, and his opening line was, "We will kill them dead or alive." And I go like, oh my God, this is a limbic man. There is no forebrain, there is no thought, there is, I've been hurt and I'll hurt anybody, and we killed hundreds of thousands of totally innocent Iraqis as a result of being limbic people at that time. I'm from Massachusetts, where they can say that. Okay. So he's a 5-year-old boy who has more mental capacities than the leader of the free world in being able to imagine other possibilities besides death and destruction. And the reason why I love this picture is because trauma is all about loss of imagination. It's all about one thing going into your limbic survival brain and setting up habitual, automatic, reactive responses. People do the same thing over and over and over again, and they stop learning from experience. And so the whole challenge of treating traumatized people is to open up the imagination, to open up new worlds, new possibilities. Huh? Imagination is everything. Like right now, if you have no imagination, all you hear is my droning on, and you may or may not enjoy it. And if you have no imagination, you cannot get out of here. If you have imagination, think about food, vacations, sex, what it'd be like to strangle me. You know, anything will do. And you'll have a great time just sitting here listening to a guy who you may or may not enjoy listening to. So imagination is everything. Imagination allows us to get out of our bodies and to project ourselves in the future. When you lose imagination, which is a huge thing for traumatized people, is you cannot imagine how things can be different, how life can be different. And so if my computer hadn't been screwed up, I would have ended my talk today with a little clip about a theater program, because I love theater as a treatment for traumatized people. And in my book, the last chapter is all about theater. And I describe a whole different bunch of programs where adults and kids and alcoholic veterans learn how to embody a different body and to feel what it feels like to not be a hopeless, stooped over alcoholic, but to be Cassius, or to be a gay transvestite, or to be whatever, and to embody a different body and to say, oh, this is what it feels like to be somebody other than my habitual stance in life. So theater is one of my favorite ways of helping people and helping myself. I like to do theater myself also, to just feel what it feels like to have to live in a different reality than the reality that you're trapped in. So that's the story of knowing. And so the question for all of us who treat traumatized people is, what do you have in your therapeutic vocabulary to help people to increase their imagination? And anybody who says, I found a treatment of choice, should immediately be banished from any academic or other institution because they're religious fanatics. Anybody who has found the only treatment is an idiot, by definition. Because there's not only one way you can resolve trauma, there's not only one way you can focus imagination. People have been doing it for hundreds of thousands of years. There's probably many, many different ways of doing it. So what happens when people get stuck? You get stuck this way, get stuck in your body. And now I want to switch my computer. Where is my friend who was going to switch the computer for me? I need her desperately.
There she is. I have no control over that, I'm sorry. Can we get some more volume out of the mic too, please? There's asking in the back
More
of the room.
volume out of the mic, okay? Okay. So this is one of the first times that I got to see what you can do with people who get stuck. And so the videotape I'm about to show you is a videotape that very clearly shows what a traumatized person looks like and how they get stuck.
Your story as I took it down last week. Start reading it.
And so in the first 2 seconds of this movie, what you see, I'm going to play it again because it's so great, is that the moment that people bring a trauma to mind, their bodies start reacting as if they're being traumatized again. And this is what makes the therapy of traumatized people so difficult, because thinking about it reinstates the whole physiological system of experience. And so people don't want to talk about their trauma. And people get over-aroused talking about their trauma, and people become frightened about their trauma. And in fact, people cannot talk about their trauma. That's really one of the most important things, is that, if you had more time, but I have it extensively in my book, is the nature of trauma, is that this whole capacity to make a narrative shuts down. I'll show you in a second, how the Broca's area shuts down. Your symbolic brain shuts down. And so afterwards you may learn to tell a cover story of more or less what happens, but this whole cognitive brain disappears when you get traumatized, and you become just a frightened animal. And here you see a woman who is like a frightened animal.
As I took it down last week. Start reading it.
And so what happens here, and we'll show it in a minute, what happens is that her limbic brain becomes activated and she starts behaving as if she's back there right now, even though she's sitting in a very nice little office with a very nice guy at Yale. Her body doesn't know that, and her body is reacting to the past. And would she come back? Probably not, because it's too scary.
I was in red light on Cherry Street. I was in the left lane, going to take a left turn onto Gulf Street. I was fully stopped because my light was red and I was behind the white line. I couldn't understand why the traffic to my left also wasn't coming out. All of a sudden, I looked up and they were touching the ground, so I thought she was going to come to our windshield and that I was going to die.
So here you see the total crunched upness of trauma. Also, our relative blindness to the evidence right in front of our face. And so I would like to invite you to sit like her for a second. You just lift your butt slightly out of your chair and go like this, and I say, it's a beautiful day at the University of Virginia. The amazing thing is, our patients sit like this all the time. And we expect them to be able to feel okay as long as their bodies hold themselves like that. And that is physiologically impossible. So unless you get somebody to hold their bodies in a different way, and that's why things like yoga and qigong and various forms of massage might be so helpful, you're stuck in this position, your mind is stuck in this position. We are bodies. Our mind is an afterthought. For this book, I may or may not at the end put it in there, I reviewed all the Nobel Prizes that got won in the 20th century for anything having to do with mind stuff, starting with Pavlov in 1904 and ending up with Edelman in 1991. And all of them say something like what Roger Sperry says in 1981. He says, the brain is the organ that makes the muscles move. It has a few other secondary functions also. And that's not really how psychologists think about the brain and about the body, because our body in our thinking is sort of an afterthought, but we are our body. And our whole brain is devoted to keep our body alive somehow, to keep our body moving. And so this is a woman who is stuck in terror. And I see this movie and I'm really upset with my friend who shows it to me. I say, yeah, okay, I've seen plenty of people like that. Some people in my clinic have started to do what he does also. They're doing something called EMDR. Anybody in this room does EMDR? Good. You have to really overcome a great deal of embarrassment to start doing EMDR. It's a crazy thing to do. Somebody sits in front of your face and they're very upset and you just say, remember what you saw, remember what you thought, remember what you smelled, but you don't have to tell me. And then just sort of follow my fingers with your eyes, and you set up a dreamlike state in people, and then after a little while, they say, it's gone. And so, it takes a lot of chutzpah to start doing that. Get out of your chair to do it. And so I was irritated with Steve. I said, okay. And then he said, wait a second, let me show you what happened next. And so next he shows me this tape of the same woman at the end of 2 sessions.
I want to do this.
And so the first thing that strikes me is that we are dealing with a different person who is totally different. And again, I would like you to assume her posture. It's a very non-characteristic Western posture. When you go to the Louvre, or the British Museum, or the Met in New York, you don't see a lot of people sitting like this. But when you go to Thailand and India and Burma, you see a lot of people sitting like this. That's interesting. And so sit like her. So put your hands in your lap. And also what I love about her is that sternocleidoid muscle. The muscle that Darwin described as the muscle of curiosity. When animals and humans get curious, they turn their neck in a particular thing. Those of us who are accustomed to dealing with traumatized people are not accustomed to seeing a lot of sternocleidomastoid muscles, because traumatized people are deeply uncurious about the world, because anything new is bound to hurt them. And we talked about it, how difficult it is for them to get excited about anything, because their whole life is a defensive life. And he is a person who after 2 sessions of wiggling somebody's fingers in front of her eyes, looks like she is very contented. So when you sit like her, now I'll give you another Massachusetts message. Think about how much you hate Dick Cheney as you sit like this. I know it's a little dangerous to say things like this, but you know, I'm a good hater. But when I sit like this, you can't do it. There is something about that posture that takes certain possibilities, makes it impossible. And so I'm really quite amazed about what I see here, because I've never, up to that point, seen people in 2 sessions move from that to that. I had a radio interview this past week with somebody, and she says, so, interview at the end of the session says, so there really are no magical answers. And I say, actually there are. There are a lot of magical answers. When you really learn how to do effective treatments, you see magic over and over again. But you don't learn it in school. You learn it later on. Maybe at the University of Virginia you learn it in school. Maybe you guys are going to do it. But nobody I know learned it in school. And so here's the same woman talking about her trauma.
Last time we were kind of at the end of things today. Can you describe what happened that day for me?
Yeah, I was going up to a traffic light, turned yellow, and I was still back, so I was going slow to begin with because the roads were wet. Stopped behind the white line. The light was red. Traffic to my left isn't moving, wondered why. Looked up, saw a car come speeding at me. I just knew it was going to hit me and I was going to die. I didn't. It's fading. I can almost say right now, don't even ask me anything more about the accident, because I'm not interested in discussing it. Not that I want to hide it, but I'm not. It's over.
So, one important reason why I'm showing you this is that in most research studies on PTSD, people are satisfied when they say, we have found this great treatment because our patients get 10% better and their CAP score drops from 75 to 55. That's a sham. The goal is to get this. And it can be done. And if you don't know how to do it with your patients yet, as I'm not with my patients, all of my patients either, that just means that we have not explored beyond our traditional boundaries. Because I've done this now for a very long time, and I keep finding various ways that allow people to get there. But very few of them are based on sitting in a chair, yakking about how badly you feel. Although it's important to be understood. And actually one of the proudest chapters in my book is my chapter on language, and how miraculous it is to sit with something and to put it into words, and to have somebody understand you, and how amazing it is that to have language. And then I talk about how trauma oftentimes shuts down your capacity for language. And I talk about how usually most traumatized people are too ashamed about who they are and how they are reacted to even have words for their trauma. And they talk about another thing that one of the main things I learned in my own psychoanalysis is this curious thing about, I found it, I would be lying on the couch, and I talk about some really painful memory. And then my analyst, who very much did not share my cultural background, so I had to teach him a lot, he wasn't very interested in that, I find that I was in a dilemma. I could either continue to explain things to my analyst, or I could feel my feelings. But I could not do the same thing at the same time. And then later on, a whole bunch of various neuroscience researchers found that indeed this is part of what happens in the brain. That if you think about a very painful personal event, and you don't talk about it, you activate one track. And if you start talking about it, you disengage from much of the track. You activate a whole different track. And that reminds me of many of my patients, is that they come to therapy in order not to have to feel, in order not to have to be in touch with themselves. And it's such a release that for a moment you can escape from yourself by talking to somebody else about yourself. But that's not therapy. That is sort of running away from yourself. And so there's this whole very complex relationship with language, which I wish people in our profession would talk about much more. And so when I got into EMDR, my colleagues would say, that's crazy, how does it work? And I say, yeah, it is crazy, and God knows how it works. And then, of course, then there's language. Of course, you know exactly how language works, doesn't it? And then there's Prozac. Nobody ever says don't give Prozac to people. And we know exactly how Prozac works because the drug companies have taught us. All of us who have got medical journals in the mail, you have a little circle here, that's the presynaptic cleft, and a little circle, the postsynaptic cleft, and you see these little white balls, there's serotonin, and it jumps, and that tells you how Prozac works. Well, that's, at least we know that. But we have no clue about how language works. And I think we should know a lot more about how language works, because it is damn interesting how language works and what it does for us. That's why I hang around with early childhood development people, because they tend to know stuff like that. I'll show you another tape now. So, very quickly, maybe I should almost skip this. So I went to NIMH and did a study to compare what I thought at that time was the best treatment for PTSD, EMDR, this crazy treatment, versus Prozac. I had done the first studies on Prozac for PTSD, so I had a good track record, and they gave me the money, and then we did a study, and then we enrolled 100 people, and these are the people who got placebo, and after 8 weeks of getting placebo, those patients got 44% better. And so if you treat traumatized people and you don't get them 44% better, you are being beaten by an inert pill. You need to re-examine what you're doing. Most of the evidence-based treatments that are being promulgated have at best sort of that 44%. And so there's this whole question how effective they all are. This is Prozac, slightly better in our study, statistically insignificant, but if you have a lot of money to run a lot of people and get major statistical power, you can make this difference statistically significant. It all depends on how big your money pot is at home. And then you have EMDR, which is much better than either of the two of them. And after 8 weeks, we send everybody home, and we say, good luck to you. And we say to these people, you got nothing. Would you like to get either EMDR or Prozac? And it's another story. And then 2 months later, we go see everybody again, and the Prozac people has become a little bit worse, and the EMDR people has got a little bit better, and then we say goodbye, see you 6 months, and 6 months later, the Prozac people still aren't back to baseline, which really surprises me, because they're not taking anything right now, and they're worse, and the EMDR people continue to improve. So that's nice. And then we do some studies on how EMDR works. There's still a big study right now. Too long a story to go into that right now. It's very interesting. And then we measure not so much whether people's PTSD improves, we measure whether people are like that lady in that movie who say, it's gone. I can tell you about it, but it doesn't matter. So at the end of 8 weeks, 1 out of about 5 EMDR people say it's all gone. 1 out of 8 project people. 2 months later, 1 out of 5 people, 3 people on EMDR say it's all gone. None of the project people. Another 6 months later, 60% of the people on the EMDR say it's all gone. None of the project people. This is the best outcome of any study done in PTSD outcome studies right now. And so, it's just data. There is a threat to my little record. Because right now, Michael Mithoever and his friends are doing a study in South Carolina. And they're using ecstasy, or MNDA. And their results look about as good as this. And when they first told me about their work and showed me their data, I said that makes perfect sense. Because the secret of overcoming your trauma is that your brain needs to be calm enough to revisit the scene and have all the parts of your brain that got bumped offline because you're in a state of terror to stay online. And so the critical element in helping people to reintegrate and reprocess the trauma is to put them in a state of physiological safety. And then you can look at yourself, and I think hypnosis traditionally was the best way that people did it, but hypnosis right now is in the doghouse and nobody is studying it. Someday it will come back probably. The secret is to get people in a state of calm from which they can notice what happened back then and reprocess it, and then lost stuff in that. Basically. So anything that gets you in that state of contemplative calm, and that's why your work becomes very important again, will eventually make it possible for people to look at what happened back then and to remove it through the brain and to say, like this lady, yeah, it happened. It was pretty awful back then. But today is September 26th, 2014, and it's a beautiful day in Charlottesville. And that's really where you want people to get. So that was one. The time is beginning to run short, which is too bad. And then we got into another favorite or a subject, and that is that one of the things that became very clear right after we created the PTSD diagnosis is that PTSD is quite a wonderful diagnosis for adults who get raped or assaulted or go to war, and that there is a much larger population of people who get abused by their own intimates, who get abused by their own parents, who get neglected by their own parents, who are also traumatized and who have a very different clinical picture, although some overlapping things. And I've wasted an unbelievable amount of energy getting a new diagnosis in the DSM that would actually represent what really happens to chronically traumatized people who right now can get any of 13 different diagnoses, almost all of which are trauma-related, like oppositional defiant disorder, conduct disorder. We have a new out-of-control behavior disorder and self-mutilation disorder. These are all trauma diagnoses, and they're all bullshit diagnoses that don't make any sense. And my one thing I'm really upset about is that my book that came out yesterday is doing very well, but the DSM is still outselling us, and that is a terrible thing, because when your diagnostic system becomes more delusional than your patients, you're in serious trouble. And so what we found is that EMDR worked great for adults who got traumatized, and it didn't do nearly as well for people who were traumatized as kids in the context of intimate relationships. And that's a very big subject that I cannot go into great detail, but I'll start opening this up. Because that is another area. And the other area is what happens in the brain and what happens in the brain as you develop and you get traumatized. And that's actually a very long topic. So let's first of all go into the brain. And that is that this is our brain. And when you say to me, hi, my name is Jennifer, I think to myself, very nice, prefrontal cortex, that's part of you that has language, that can understand yourself, that can explain things, that can tell you what you stand for, believe in, and all that sort of good stuff. And the rest of you, it just happens. Whether you like me or not is not up to your frontal lobe, it's some other part of your brain. Whether you get scared, it's not up to you, it's another part of your brain. Whether you get deeply aroused by something, it's not up to you, it's another part of you. And it's all sitting in the nether part of your brain. And that's also where trauma mainly sits. And so we're dealing with these parts of the brain, and this is where it all happens. Let me see how much I have. Oh, that's good. And so there's our brain sort of cut open. And so at the bottom we have our reptilian brain. Now this becomes very important for the contemplative practice, science. Our reptilian brain is the part of our brain that we come into the world with, that does the things that little babies can do, and that all civilized people like to ignore. This part of your brain that makes you poop and pee and breathe and scream and cry and be awake and be asleep. And so we barely talk about these things, but when you get traumatized, that's where it hits. If you get traumatized, it affects your eating, it affects your sleeping, it affects your core arousal system, and there are no ways, almost no ways, of getting from here to there. So very few people have the capacity to talk themselves into going to sleep. And even fewer people have the capacity to make themselves not hungry when they are starving, that sort of thing. And so we have no control over that. And so our job, dealing with trauma, is to become part of, help the reptilian brain to calm itself down. Of course, as we raise children, we learn a lot about that, because we deal with little kids with reptilian brains who are screaming through the night and do stuff like that. And what do you do with little kids who do happen? You do things that we don't do with our adults in our practices, but maybe we should. Pick them up, hold them, rock them, make them feel safe, sing to them, make funny noises, be silly, stuff like that. Yeah? And so there's a lot there that you can all explore in your center. Then the issue, limbic system. And your limbic system is the part of the brain that comes online that makes your map of the world. So you come into the world, you're this weird creature that needs to be socialized, and we have pretty good ideas about how that process works these days. If I can't talk about it, it's in the book. And then, as you come into the world, you need to make a map of who you are in relationship to the world around you. And you create a map of the world. What is safe? What is dangerous? Am I lovable? Am I good? Am I bad? And that becomes the hardwired part of your brain over here. And it tells you about relationships with things. And this is based on experience. And Bruce Perry was the first person who really beautifully talked about it, is that the brain is a use-dependent organ. And so if, as an early kid, you're 4 years old and your grandmother comes over for your birthday party, slobbers you with kisses and says, "You're the most wonderful kid I've ever seen," no 4-year-old will say, "Grandma, there's about 2 billion kids in the world. I'm probably somewhere in the middle of that U-shaped curve, you're a little exaggerated." No, those kisses land on you and they become part like, I'm a wonderful person who makes the world smile. And that map of your world stays with you for the rest of your life on some level. And other piece of research that we did that showed is that if you can recall those experiences when you're little, you will respond to psychotherapy, because the attention of a therapist will reactivate the memories of having been loved and having been seen. But what our research also showed is that if you have no memory of having been loved like that and smiled like that, you do not respond to psychotherapy. And then maybe to your method. And then you need to do some whole other bunch of things, because the basic sort of foundation for that is not in place. And so now we start talking about not only about trauma, but we start talking about the issue that's even larger than trauma. That's the issue of disorganized attachment. I'll touch on that a little bit, but in our field right now we are totally confusing those two and saying that these things are the same thing. They're not the same thing. They're not the same thing biologically, neurobiologically, psychotherapeutically. Being not seen, not understood, not responded to, not being in sync with, is a whole different kettle of fish of having terrible memories of a particular event. And the academic world is not really in any way close to getting that. Most clinicians who do this work, of course, cannot deny that reality. So the opposite, of course, is when you're 4 years old and your mother is lying drunk in front of the air conditioner and says, "Look what you did to me. I was on my way to become a Metropolitan Opera star, but because you came into our family, you ruined our family." That becomes your map of the world also. And all people who have those experiences will fundamentally feel terrible about themselves. And as a therapist, we tend to, initially, when we're young and innocent, say to our patients, "Oh, you shouldn't feel that way." I now have a rule that if I say to my patients, "You shouldn't feel that way," I don't charge for that session, because it's a stupid thing to say. I still do it sometimes. And you try to explain to people, "Oh, it wasn't your fault, you were just a little girl, and he did this to you, and yes, you loved him, but it's his responsibility." And I used to do it a lot until one time a patient of mine said to me, I was in a group, same thing happened again, and she said, "You know, Bessel, I've known you long enough now that I can really finally be honest with you. I know how important it is for you to feel like a good therapist. So when, and I've been trained to take care of narcissistically vulnerable men. I'm an incest victim, so I'm always here sort of taking care of your needs. But when you say that stupid shit to me, I really feel like I'm so alone. He doesn't get it, how I feel fundamentally evil. And he's just giving this little palabrum to make himself feel better about how helpless he feels, about how he can make me feel better." And I say, "That's really very helpful, thank you." And you don't want to say, I won't charge you for this session because this was worth a lot, what you just taught me. And so then the question becomes, how do you go into these very deep notions about oneself? And some very good things have happened in that regard. And the first time I saw some move there was in the same group that this first woman was in. I had a woman there who was a PhD psychologist who had been sexually abused, who also ran a group home for sexually abused kids. And one day she comes in and said, "I had an amazing experience this weekend. I went to an EMDR training," and that's before my conversion. So I roll my eyes and say, "Oh my God, another cult follower." And I don't say it, but I'm thinking it. And then she says, "Can I talk about it?" And I said, "Well, you have to ask the group." And the group said, "I'd love to hear it." And so she says, "I went through this EMDR session, and as I was moving my finger, as I was going through it, I saw this 7-year-old kid who I was being molested by my father. And I was this scrawny little 7-year-old. I was this tiny little girl. And there's this gigantic whale, or smelly, alcoholic, hairy guy ramming himself into that little girl. It's just disgusting. How can a guy do that to a little girl?" So being, again, in that position of a quiet, observing self, noticing what happened, not to you, because it's a different person from you, it was you as a little girl. That you could see, oh, that happened to that little girl back then. And so that opened up a whole other series of therapeutic needs Namely, how do you get people in a position where they can observe themselves back there compassionately, not as I went through that, but there's this 4-year-old, or there was this 8-year-old, and let me look at what happened to that 8-year-old. And the main thing that I practice for that is something called IFS, Internal Family Systems Therapy, which I found extraordinarily helpful for people to go back then. And one of the main things you find when you deal with it is that when you ask people, how do you feel about that 4-year-old girl who was being molested, they will say, I hate that girl. And I see some of you being surprised when I say that. People hate the traumatized selves. They can't stand it. And they want you to take care of that traumatized person because they can't stand the traumatized part. And so the therapeutic enterprise becomes to stand back and to learn to compassionately observe what that kid went through and to observe how scared that kid was, how helpless that kid felt, and to observe all the things that you wish that kid had done but didn't do, that you feel so ashamed about, or all the things that that kid did in order to survive that you feel bad about right now. But the issue of survival is rarely an uncomplicated matter, and people who have survived neglect and abuse hate themselves for having been abused and neglected, and so one needs to go there. And so it's activating that contemplative, compassionate self to revisit that scene of the past and to start moving those things around. Okay, so that is the limbic system therapy I'm talking about. That's my time. It's bad. Let me just quickly say this. We did the first neuroimaging study of traumatized people. So we put 8 traumatized people in the scanner, and we induced people a flashback in people. And what's quite important, I think therapists sort of know and sort of don't know, is that if you want to get into the trauma, you want to go into the experiential mode. You want to go into what did I feel, what did I see, what were the sounds like, what were the smells like, what did he smell like, what did I see at that point. You go into the sensory part of experience. And when you do that, people start feeling the trauma again. If you stay in the abstract minds about how awful it was back then, how terrible it was, how relaxed you were, sort of more another part of your brain, you don't activate the trauma. You also don't change the trauma. So you need to go there in order to change it. But going there is so complicated. So that's the big hullabaloo. In this case, when we did this first study, we weren't worried yet, or in part of our ignorance, in part because ignorance of the institutional review board, because if they had known how we would torture people by having to have a flashback in the scanner, they would probably not have allowed us to do this. Very serious. We have people lie there and feel as if they're being raped right now. And so here we're making scripts for people in which we evoke the precise images, sounds, etc., etc. This is a script of a woman who had picked up her daughter from school. The seatbelt wasn't working, so she leaned over to fasten her daughter's seatbelt. As she was leaning over, she went through red lights. Kid was killed, the fetus was killed. That's trauma. I mean, that's the stuff we see all the time. And so we have these pictures, and this is really, for me, very important. And that is, what we saw is a composite picture of 8 people. What lights up, like a lighthouse, when people are having flashbacks, is a mirror image. So there's the front of the brain, the back of the brain, and there's the right of the brain, there's the left of the brain, and what lights up is the right amygdala. And it's the right limbic area, that's where the trauma sits. When that gets activated, you feel terrified, you activate your stress hormones, you can measure the stress hormones. And now, and I don't have time to talk about it because it's really my favorite subject these days, when we try to rewire people's brain function with neurofeedback by having people play computer games with their own brains, we focus very much on that right temporal lobe, where there are so many abnormalities oftentimes, and we try to rewire that fear system of the brain to develop different activation patterns by reinforcing them with computer games. So that's where the trauma sits in the brain. And then what also lights up as people remember the trauma is Brodmann's area 19, that's the visual cortex, so people actually see the images, very lifelike visual images, very unusual. Only traumatized people have these imprints of precisely what they saw or heard. The rest of us are not so fortunate. I try to remember exactly what that last wonderful vacation felt like, or that try to have a reliving experience of that last night of love that you experienced. Our brain doesn't do that for us. But if you get traumatized, our brain does it for you. And this was the most important part for me, because it showed what goes offline when people are reliving their trauma. Of the brain over here, Broca's area, the speech center of the brain. So when people are in the middle of reliving their trauma, speech goes offline. As the bard said, people are struck with speechless terror. They become dumbfounded. And people become dumbfounded, which is hard for all of us verbal people, because when you go there, your brain takes leave of itself and you disappear. And so this little dot made me explore non-verbal methods of therapy to go around the tyranny of this frozen brain. So that was important. And then the other thing was quite important to go back to this picture, is that one side of the brain lights up and not the other side of the brain. The right side of the brain lights up, not the left side of the brain. The left side of the brain becomes deactivated. The left side of the brain is our rational, analyzing, understanding, figuring out part of your brain. The more traumatized you are, the less capacity for analytical thought you have. All the stuff that you need to be a good scholar, to be a good therapy patient, goes offline because that part of the brain isn't working. Otherwise, it's very simple. This is a study done by my friend Marilyn Clocher, who still is doing CBT type work. And this is her first study. It's a study of sexually abused adolescent girls. And at the end of the study, she notices how much warmth has been developed between her staff and the subjects in the study, and she is convinced that the therapeutic relationship, the alliance, is the critical change factor. And being a scientist, she tests her hypothesis. Always a good thing to do, test your hypothesis. Because sometimes you come up with very interesting contradictions to what you thought, including the fact that the therapeutic alliance is the most important part of whether people get better. It's just non-significant with a negative trend. And that's why you do science. You go like, ooh, that must have been badly done. Or maybe there's something there that's worth paying attention to. And so Marilyn is also curious about it. And then she shows a lot of other potential factors in the path analysis. And she comes up with the critical issue. It's called negative mood regulation, self-regulation. And what she finds that if the therapist is capable of helping patients with self-regulation issues, they get better. So therapists are only as good as they are self-regulatory people. And that's why it's such a privilege for me to be here, because you guys are about the only institution that I know of that takes this stuff seriously. And in order to overcome your trauma, you need to learn to regulate yourself. That's the number one issue. And then the big question is, how do you do that? I have some thoughts about it. I'm not sure if we have time for that, because I want to show you something else first. Well, there's one way of doing it. I'm trying to time myself because we have only a very short period of time. This is a slide I got from Joseph Ledoux, the neuroscientist, who came to my annual conference, and he shows that the rational understanding, figuring out part of your brain has no pathways to that fear, irrational, scared part of your brain. And so you cannot get there. And so that's very bad news if you do try to make people behave themselves and be reasonable and not feel stupid stuff, because you cannot get there by reason. So what Leduno finds is that there is a way of getting there. That's via your medial prefrontal cortex, the middle part of your brain. The middle part of your brain, the way that our brain is built up, and it's very relevant to you guys, you probably all know this already, is that most of our brain is a social brain. We are very social creatures. And you see this when you see kids develop. The right side of your brain, left side of your brain, on either side, is to help us to engage with the world and find a common language and common culture with other people. So we have a cultural brain. And as a friend at Tony taught me, the brain is a cultural organ, and it gets shaped by culture. And it's this culture. But there's a part of the brain that is devoted to you and your relationship to yourself. That is they call the mohawk of the brain. Starts at the medial prefrontal cortex, orbital prefrontal cortex, anterior cingulate, posterior cingulate. That's devoted to you and your relationship to you. And so when you feel right now how you're breathing, or how your neck is sitting on top of your torso, you maybe want to try it out for a second, and feel how fast or how slow you're breathing, you activate the part of your brain, that's the interoceptive brain. That's the only part of your brain that has access to the deep survival fear-driven brain. There is no other way to get there. So in order to do this work, you have to learn to notice yourself, and to feel yourself, become aware of yourself, and to notice your internal sensations. A terrifying experience for traumatized people, because in popular culture, people think about trauma still as a story about an event that happened some time ago. Wrong perception. That event is over. It's gone, it appeared, come and gone. Trauma is the imprint that leaves on your internal sensory world. The fact that you feel gut wrench, heartbreak, falling apart inside of you, and that gets activated all the time, and you're reliving your trauma right now, even though it's over. And so there's basically two ways of changing that we know of. One is via the top, via activating the medial prefrontal cortex, the contemplative part of yourself, knowing yourself, feeling yourself, experiencing yourself, feeling your body, noticing a very important issue, that certain feelings, sensations may be very uncomfortable, but part of trauma is that your time sense, your timekeeper in your brain goes offline, and so when you're trapped in trauma, it feels like this will last forever. And so one of the great things about contemplative practices is that you sit there and you feel discomfort, and you feel hurt, and you feel stuff, and you keep breathing, and you notice that as you stay with it, everything changes. That the world, that your body stays in constant state of flux. One of the core things that we all need to learn, but particularly when you're traumatized, is that nothing stays the same. And to learn to live what you feel, and to not act, and to feel, to notice what happens next. And so to my mind, the most important sentences for therapy is notice that. Notice that. And next thing is to say, and notice what happens next. And you help to reestablish that flow. The other way in which you can change that core limbic feature is via the bottom up, via breathing, touch, rhythm, and movement. And so you don't have a lot of time to go into it, but there's the other critical thing. So sooner or later, all of us start hanging around with people like that. And now we know that that contemplative part of your brain, sort of located over here, that the size of that part of your brain determines how reactive you are to your environment. And so if you have a big orbital prefrontal, medial prefrontal cortex, you see stuff happening, you go like, another asshole. If it's very small, you go, oh look what they're doing to me. So your reactivity is determined by that part of your brain. And then the big question is, it's nice to discover these things, but are these parts of your brain flexible? And that's where the whole issue of neuroplasticity comes in, is what can be changed and what can be changed. It turns out that your medial prefrontal cortex is very neuroplastic. And if you spend a lot of time feeling yourself, noticing yourself, you can actually change the activation of your medial prefrontal cortex, as shown by Sarah Lazar and Britta Hutzel and other people like that. And if you spend a lot of time with yourself, you can also open up another very important part of your brain called the insula, which is the part of your brain that connects you with your body. And traumatized people have terrible relationships with their bodies. And why is that? Because their body keeps the score. Their body holds the trauma. And they feel terrible, and they have feelings of heartache and gut wrench, and they try to shut off their relationship to themselves. And as you shut off your relationship to yourself, you shut off your capacity for pleasure, engagement, and joy together with pain and hurt. And so that insula needs to be re-woken up, needs to be woken up by having deep physical sensations. My time is almost up. I do want to show one more movie before we go. This is actually a very big part of the whole thing, but we don't have much time. I want to just give you one inkling of interpersonal neurobiology and how we change each other. And if I had much more time, I would also talk about how this system gets totally messed up when you get hit, hurt, abandoned, and traumatized by the people around you. So this is a little tape from the laboratory of my friend Ed Tronick, who is an attachment researcher in Boston. And he studies a paradigm called this still-faced paradigm. And I wish I could talk about it for many hours, because it's really my favorite subject. And so he has people play with each other, mothers and kids usually, and then at some point he tells the mom, drop out of this dance. Freeze your face, stop talking, and become an immobile object. And I'm showing this for you for many reasons, but one of them is I want to have a momentary inkling of how our bodies affect each other. Because as you see this movie, this boy gets quite upset. And hopefully you will feel something in your body too. Because our bodies have a profound effect on each other. And if I stand here and I'm joyful and filled with mindfulness and open-hearted, you will feel joyful, mindful, and open-hearted. And if I am a nasty, mean person, you will feel like a nasty, mean person also. These are mirror neurons that stimulate each other, and our mirror neurons that are our main therapeutic tool. That who we are will determine how our patients and our partners feel. And so it is illustrated by this nice movie.
Here's your juice. Here you go. Oh, the dinosaur's gonna drink the juice? Good. Oh no, that
And you think, oh, they're just talking childish language. But in fact, most of our conversations are about as meaningful as that. And you hear people in Boston talk about the Red Sox or football games, whatever. But if the other person shares your love for the Red Sox or whatever the hell your team is, you get excited together. You say, this person really gets me. And it doesn't take deep stuff. It just takes some common, I also like chicken curry, and you like chicken curry. Oh, so we must be friends forever. Like, and so people have fun. As long as they're in the same wavelength and love the same thing, they're having fun together.
Oh no, that Oh, you can do the dinosaur cake? That's nice.
Now she's told to freeze her face. Everything okay up to now?
I do.
And you hear the distress come up in his voice from his reptilian brain. Feel anything yet in your at your limbic brain playing tricks on you? Mommy, it's me, he says. You're a noisy audience.
Alligator, what's the alligator do? Oh, give me kiss me.
Very expressive, you guys. That's it. So peace has been restored, and nothing happened. You hope it's the worst thing that ever happened in this boy's life. This stuff happens all the time, incessantly to people. And if you get the sort of repair that you get a brain that expects that you can live through bad things because good things will follow it. If you don't get the repair, you get a brain that doesn't expect repair. And there's a whole lot of talk, but all kind of terrible things happen. So, nothing happens. 6 months later, the boy comes back to the laboratory. He has a little measurement for his serum cortisol. He walks into the room where this happened, and his serum cortisol just goes up a little bit. There's no memory for this. There's just something in the back of his brain that's come to register certain environments as associated with fear. That's how our brain gets formed. Our brain is filled with stuff that we have no notion of, have no words for, that gets triggered in all kind of different directions. And so our great challenge, and I hope you guys will provide us with all the answers of that in the Center for Contemplative Science, is how do we get to the back of that brain to rewire it so we can feel safe and focused and be in the present. Thank you very much. I'll take questions, yeah.